In this lecture, we're going to turn our attention to Africa and to the East. In the main model that will be used, and although not exclusively in these missions, particularly with regard to China and Japan, is the model that I call the Jesuit model. It is closer to the ideal laid out in the Instructio from the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. What the missionaries will encounter, especially in their Eastern missions, is cultures just as sophisticated as European cultures in their eyes, and so their path forward is much more complicated than a purely controversial role of our culture versus the existing culture, say, that the Spanish took up when confronting the Aztec civilization. So we're going to look first at Africa, where some important gains were made, but kind of the great conversion of Africa to Christianity is still going to have to wait till the 20th century in particular. But there are some valiant efforts made here in the 16th and the 17th century. And then we're going to turn our attention to the East. One of the first encounters with sub-Saharan Africa is that the Portuguese were able to save Ethiopia from a military threat coming out of the Islamic world. But the Portuguese and the Ethiopian Christians were unable to understand each other. And in the end, this intolerance of the Portuguese for the version of Christianity as practiced by the Ethiopians meant that there wasn't sort of a restoration between contact between Ethiopian Christianity and the Western Church. So this is kind of a prelude of things to come, which is especially the Portuguese authorities, have a very hard time processing Eastern Christianity, particularly Eastern Christianity, which has its connections to a linguistic tradition that is not Greek and is different from what they have come to expect from the Byzantine context. So Ethiopia was kind of yes, Ethiopia was saved initially, but it was not a moment for increased positive relations. So Christianity first comes to sub-Saharan Africa in Western Christianity is first comes to sub-Saharan Africa through the trading ports established by the Portuguese along the coast as they move their way south looking for passage to India. Some of the first establishments will be the islands off the coasts of Africa as the Portuguese work their way down, but that's for the colonials. By 1491, the Portuguese missionaries were able, however, to convert the powerful king of the Kingdom of Congo, Nzinga Anakubu. And Nzinga Nakubu actually sent his son, Nzinga Mbembe, to be educated in Portugal, and while there, Nzinga took the name of Alfonso I and will be known to the West afterwards as King Alfonso I. And so Nzinga Mbembe and his dynasty will be thoroughly Christian and dedicated to the church and will seek to do all that they can to spread the faith within their own kingdom. And this follows a pattern we can kind of see in sub-Saharan Africa of the kings, the elites converting to the religion of especially one of their major trade partners, which we kind of have seen, you can see in how many of the kings, especially in West Africa, became Muslim, although their population still retained their traditional beliefs and didn't join the kings and their elite in the practice of the faith. But returning to the Kingdom of Congo, the Nzinga Alfonso I brings in Portuguese missionaries and they will establish schools and win more converts. Nzinga will seek to establish, he'll build churches, he will promote the faith, and he will even send off his son to go be trained in Europe, and his son will come back and will be the first sub-Saharan African bishop to to be a bishop in the Kingdom of Congo, although the church will actually give him the titular see of Utica. And this is Dom Enrique Aquino Mbembe, who will die in 1531. So the dynasty in the Kingdom of Congo goes out of its way to establish Christianity in its realm. One of the tools used in the Kingdom of Congo will actually be extremely important in the conversions of efforts of Africa in the 20th century, which is due to a lack of priests. Although the Kingdom of Congo is establishing native clergy right away, due to a lack of priests, the lay catechists are used extensively by the Kingdom of Congo to spread the faith to their people. And this office, this kind of way of teaching the faith, will be taken up more robustly in the 20th century. What frustrates Christianity in the Kingdom of Congo, and the dynasty will be dedicated to it for the next few centuries, but what will always frustrate it is the Portuguese efforts to control the church in the Kingdom of Congo under the banner of patronage, under the banner of the control given to them by the Treaty of Tordesillas. They'll even try to use this power of patronage as a way to control who gets to be elected kings in the Kingdom of Congo. So between conflicts with the Portuguese over ecclesiastical affairs, actual conflict, direct conflicts with the Portuguese colony Angola, and also the simmering issue always of the Portuguese trafficking in slaves, will lead to great frustration on the part of the growth of Christianity in the Kingdom of Congo. The great withering of and reversion to paganism that will occur in the area will actually come in the 18th century, when Portugal will basically cut off the flow of foreign missionaries into the area, and this will drain the region of personnel and will lead to major setbacks in the kingdom. But it's the Kingdom of Congo is probably the greatest success story in terms of sub-Saharan Africa in this period. The there are other efforts in on the continent of Africa as well, and we can see some efforts, especially by the Capuchins and the Jesuits, who will show up later, making converts in the area of present-day Angola, and then also within the Kingdom of Congo itself, especially the Capuchins. Some success was achieved in Mozambique. The Jesuits were able to convert a king, and they had their own bishop starting in about the 1560s, but the whole thing collapses by 1614. There are valiant attempts to convert in Madagascar, and Madagascar seems to only win crowns for the missionaries and not too many converts. Really, many of these efforts came to an end with the change of the religion of a king. So not unlike Europe, really. Missionaries would slowly collapse in the face of opposition, especially the opposition coming from the kings would come due to polygamy, and then the lack of personnel would greatly undermine the faith, and it's taking deep root in this period. So the great conversion of Africa to Christianity will have to wait for a different story. So there are successes and there are failures, but we see some of the most important issues that will emerge for the Eastern missions, which is the actions on the part of the Portuguese, in particular their intense zeal to guard their powers of patronage while lacking the military supremacy, will lead to many issues and many conflicts over the spread of the faith. The Portuguese are, of course, the first Europeans to establish, well, since the Romans, to establish trading posts on the subcontinent. So the Portuguese did not have a military supremacy, but they would always remain very insistent on their rights of patronage. And as we saw with Ethiopia, the Portuguese, fraternal charity is not a high priority when it comes to dealing with Eastern churches, with Eastern Christians, especially communities that are connected to the Antiochian tradition, which the Portuguese are quick to say churches with Nestorian roots. So the Portuguese gained power in the port town of Goa in 1511, and the friars would arrive in 1518. Goa would have an archbishop in 1558, and the Archbishop of Goa in 1600 would be elevated to be the primate of Asia. So basically, the Archbishop of Goa is in charge of all of the Eastern missions. The Portuguese were able to establish relations with the St. Thomas Christians. These are Christians who, in India, who claim a tradition going all the way back to the Apostle of St. Thomas. And they were able to be brought into communion with Rome by the Synod of Diamper in 1599. At that synod, the idea is to help the Thomas Christians remove some errors that had crept in over the years, particularly by following the church in Persia, and to help bring the St. Thomas Christians into greater alignment with Chalcedonian Orthodoxy. The actual canons of the synod themselves are somewhat disputed. There's kind of textual confusion about exactly what was done at the Synod of Diamper. The idea was that the Thomas Christians would be freed of abuses and that they would be brought into alignment with Rome. The St. Thomas Christians are Hindu in culture. They are Syrian in their liturgical practices. And the Portuguese seem to take the Synod of Diamper not as an opportunity to bring the Thomas Christians into unity with Rome, but they took the Synod of Diamper, the execution of the Synod of Diamper, especially by the Archbishop at the time, Alexis de Menses, as an opportunity to enforce Latinization on these St. Thomas Christians. These, of course, those that remain in union with Rome, these are our Sierra Malabar Church. But the way in which the Portuguese enforced the Synod of Diamper and the policy of Latinization followed by the archbishops at Goa will lead to many schisms and fractures within the community of the St. Thomas Christians a number of different times, each prolonging the kind of pain of the disunity of that community even down to this day. So, probably the best way to talk about the Portuguese efforts in and around Goa and with dealing with St. Thomas Christians is that many in the local population around Goa, their word for baptism literally meant turning Portuguese. So the initial missions in India and around Goa, um, are a source of a failure to preserve the unity between the Thomas Christians and the Western Christians in their arrival. The picture for India looks a little bit different when we turn our attention further south to the area in southern India. In southern India, we see enter onto the scene a whirlwind of missionary zeal known as Francis Xavier. Francis Xavier, an early companion of Ignatius of Loyola, desperately ask to go on missions, especially to the east. Eventually, Ignatius will let him go, and once that boundless energy is released, he will bounce from place to place with a relentless zeal for souls. Where he arrives in India is first along the Pearl Coast, so the very southern tip of the subcontinent, and apparently with reports of conversions in the thousands. After that, he'll move on to Indonesia, and then he'll bounce on to Japan, and then he'll eventually die awaiting entry to China. Xavier follows a very similar pattern wherever he goes. He makes initial converts, he lays the foundations for the missions, and then he picks up and moves on looking for another prize. So Xavier lays the foundation for the College of Holy Faith in Goa as a missionary training facility, and his body would be found incorrupt when it's brought back from Macau and interred at Goa, although his arm is sent to Rome and is currently at the Jesu. So profound is the impact of Francis Xavier on the Western missions that he is loved across the East. He'll be one of the saints who is canonized in 1622, and the Japanese embassy at the time demanded from the Pope in 1585 that they hurry up and canonize him. Why is this important, this Xavier? Well, Xavier becomes the poster boy for Jesuit missions, and his devotion is spread everywhere the Jesuits will go. His letters are collected, biographies are written, and this is what Carlos Ire calls a PR masterpiece. He captured and shaped the Catholic imagination and left a permanent stamp on the missions. Wherever the Jesuits go, there you will find Xavier. Xavier, Xavier, Xavier. You can hear it everywhere from every high school, college, university founded by the Jesuits. Francis Xavier is never far behind. But what the Jesuits were promoting is his missionary zeal, his intensity for the capturing of souls. And this also shows an important development in Catholic identity of the 17th century and of the 16th and 17th century is that the exploits of these missionaries, the heroic deeds in the efforts to spread the faith are becoming a part of Catholic identity. To the missions, awareness of the missions, desire to go on missions, these are playing important roles in people's own spiritual lives. But returning our attention now to India itself, the Jesuits, when they arrived in India, their attitude was unlike the friars in the New World, and there was appreciation for the old faiths and for the cultures that they encountered. The most important step, really, is the linguistic step and the cultural step. So being able to understand the culture and being able to understand the language. And it's actually Thomas Stephen who was one of the first to lay the linguistic foundation. And here I think it's really important that although Xavier is credited with establishing Christianity, it's the quiet laborers in the field who consolidate on Xavier's gains who deserve just as much of the credit for these Eastern missions as well. So Robert de Nobley is probably one of the most famous ones, missionaries in southern India. What did he do? How did he take? What was his strategy for engaging with the people? Well, he looked around to see who the people in southern India were listening to, and he saw that it was Brahmins, so holy men in the Hindu tradition. So he began to distance himself from the Portuguese, and uh, he sought to help the Indians meet Christ in an Indian context. So he learned their major languages, and he first tried to appropriate native terms for Christian ideas, especially God. Small gains would be continued to be made, but no one went as far as Nobley. He began to dress like a Brahmin, and he was able to have controversies with the Brahmin themselves, kind of fighting with them philosophically, and actually able to convert a few. So really there's a lot more to say about Nobley, but what we can say about him is he is trying to create an avenue, a path of enculturation for people to come to Christianity within the context of their own culture. There will be, of course, tensions over his enculturation efforts, and most of them are minor. Um, the big question is with how much of these cultures should we preserve will continue to be a burning question, but will be thrown into higher relief with the fight over the Chinese rights. So the being dressing like a Brahmin, showing how some of their high cultural ideals can be fulfilled in Christianity was a path followed by Robert de Nobley. The establishment of Christianity in Japan is, of course, Francis Xavier. His gains were astounding. One of the things he did is he chose to use the word Deus to refer to God to avoid any misunderstanding. So unlike Robert de Nobley, he chose not to try to use a local word for God. He just held on to the Latin. Also, Xavier was extremely intelligent when it came to reading the political landscape of Japan at the time. He realized that the emperor was completely weak and a figurehead, and so he ingratiated himself with the leading barons of the time, the daimos. He realized also that Japan greatly admired China, which is why he desired to go to China, because if he figured if you could get China, you could get the rest of all of the cultures that looked up to and drew on Chinese culture. And so that's why he would be off. But the initial community was established about 2,000 people, and there were extremely quick results. There were over 200,000 Catholics by 1609, especially in the south. Things were going extremely well, especially after the arrival of more missionaries in 1552. Even a number of lords converted to Christianity in the 1560s, the lords of the island of Kyushu and the city of Nagasaki. The previous shogun had welcomed the Christians because of trade, but also because he was attempting to crush a different foreign influence at the time, which is Pure Land Buddhism. Once that threat was contained, however, the next shogun, um, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, came to power in the 1580s, and here the question of Christianity became much more perilous. So the mission, although it's established by Xavier, grows quickly in the middle of the 16th century. With Hideyoshi coming to power, the question of Christianity as foreign, as outside, will once again be raised. So the issue or the greater context in this is the Philippines. So the Philippines were claimed by Magellan and named for Philip II and ruled from Manila, a main trade connection between Acapulco and New Spain. But the colonization of the Philippines was according to the style of New Spain, without very many settlers, and did seem to be a peaceful conquest, but the Spanish settlers were a minority population that ruled the natives. But the Philippines would gain a bishopric by 1581, and about 650,000 converts from the Philippine Islands. Part of this is that in the Philippines there was no afterlife to speak of, and so Christianity was one of the first people to arrive um, to speak of Christianity, to speak of an afterlife, and that was enticing to the Philippines. But what does this have to do with Japan? What this has to do with Japan is that the religion and the spread of religion and the spread of the dominance of Spain go hand in hand in the Philippines. Also, the Jesuit control over the missions in Japan was undermined with the arrival of the Franciscans in 1593, and the Franciscans adopt a much more controversial attitude towards the culture at the time. You can see in your readings the Jesuit attitude, which towards the mission, which was to be as respectful as possible to the culture that they were in. This is especially the working of Alessandro Viganano, who was the chief architect of the mission, and he came in especially with a push for native clergy. Although the first native clergy are not ordained until 1601, he still laid out important foundations. His missionary model is to live immaculately, maintain politeness, give attention to rank, dress, and courtesies, eat Japanese food, keep no pigs or goats, don't eat crows, build churches in Japanese style, and train a full native clergy. And there you have a kind of good summary of this Jesuit model, so to speak, that I'm trying to present. Hideyoshi, however, was suspicious, and the friars gave him increased suspicion over the Christians. Technically, all foreign missionaries were supposed to leave in 1587, but he turned a blind eye towards the missionaries at the same time. But the beginning of persecution would come in late 1596. What happened is a Spanish galleon en route to the Philippines was blown off course and found off the coast of Japan. It was full of soldiers, firearms, cannons, and missionaries. One of the crew boasted that Spain sent missionaries in advance of her conquerors, and this led Hideyoshi into open persecution of the Christians. Hideyoshi crucified 26 Christians in Nagasaki in 1596, with a complete cross-section of society, including boys, 6 non-Japanese Franciscans, and 3 Japanese Jesuits, and 17 lay Japanese people. So it's also at this time that one of the daimos chose that he had to go into exile rather than abjure the faith, and this is our blessed samurai, Yusto Takayama Ukon, who fled to the Philippines rather than turn his hands away from the faith and attack his own Christian people. So he tried to negotiate with Hideyoshi, failed, and then went into exile as rather than gave up his titles rather than gave up the faith. The persecution of Christians dies down with Hideyoshi's death in 1598, but the precedent was set. Christianity was once again identified as foreign. And this is the big issue with the introduction of Christianity to both Japan and China, is that Japan and China are cultures that practice ancestor worship, and so novelties are not exactly something that they're open to. They venerate their past. They don't want to introduce new things. The next shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, was very suspicious of Christians, and into this, the arrival of the Dutch can be and the English can be thrown. So now the Japanese have trade connections to Europe that don't require the Portuguese, and as soon as the Dutch and the English arrive, they immediately condemn the evil Jesuits and their popish ways and give the Japanese a full burned version of the Black Legend, and this will eventually lead to the full-scale persecution by the shogun. And this full-scale persecution nearly wipes out the Christian community. It begins in 1614, and it brought to a conclusion finally with the defeat and execution of some 30,000 Christian rebels at the Shimabara Rebellion in 1637-1638. So the crushing of the Christian church in Japan was nearly complete and achieved during the shogunate, especially of Ieyasu, although it will be persecutions can continue and there'll be a continual watch for Christianity at the time. Although surprisingly, when Japan was cracked open in the 19th century, they will find that there's actually small groups of people that were there, and when they contacted the Westerners, they said they were still awaiting the return of the black robes, by which they meant the Jesuits. So Japan is one of the greatest success stories and one of the greatest tragedies and travesties in the mission fields in the East, from amazing gains to a complete collapse in the space of about 50, 60 years. There are, of course, other efforts in Korea and in Vietnam and other places throughout the East. Wherever the Christian kingdoms went and traded, the missionaries would attempt to go as well. But the big prize, the grand prize for the missions in the East is, of course, China. How to evangelize China is a question that would perplex the church both back in Europe and abroad well into the 18th century, and then it still will present a challenge even to this day. The gateway to China that was established was Macau. The Portuguese established a port on the island off the mainland in 1557, of which the Portuguese would retain some control over until 1999. In 1576, colonists would receive their first bishop, but China's mainland remained closed. The groundwork for the Chinese mission was laid by the Jesuits, especially by Michel Ruggieri, an Italian, who would establish a school to teach newcomers the language, especially Mandarin. But the Chinese mission was its greatest success comes from Ruggieri's student Matteo Ricci. Matteo Ricci arrived in 1582, a Jesuit, a brilliant mind, a linguist, an Italian, but well versed in things that the Chinese were particularly interested in, which was mathematics, geography, and astronomy. Matteo Ricci was so learned, he had kind of in his mind the best of the learning of the beginning of the scientific turn in the 16th century in Europe, and with this kind of wealth of knowledge, he is able to entice attention eventually from the Chinese court. So both Ruggieri and Ricci were both of the accommodationist school, this idea of trying to find a way to use the culture in order to spread the gospel. Their first step was to dress up as Buddhist monks because it seemed kind of obvious, pretty close. They have monks, we have monks, let's try that. That fails. Their next step was to maybe imitate Taoist priests, and that didn't work for them well either. So Ricci and Ruggieri took a good look around and to see who was actually influential in Chinese culture at the time, and they realized that it was actually the Neo-Confucian scholars who were the most important at the time. So Ricci and Ruggieri began to dress as Confucian scholars, as you can see in the picture here, and Matteo Ricci dedicated himself to demonstrating not just the harmony, he dedicated himself to showing the harmony and fulfillment of Christian thought in Christianity. So successful was he in showing how Christianity fulfills the best elements of Confucius's thought that frequently the Jesuits would be called Western Confucians. Probably what got him the greatest attention of the emperor and the imperial court would be that he brought in the best of mechanical devices in Europe. So telescopes, mechanical clocks, other enticing things. They would decorate their house with images that were thoroughly Christian but done in Chinese style, and then they would invite the Chinese elite to tea. And this idea of enticing them through their curiosity, but in cultural norms that they could understand, it worked. It was a slow and measured pace. We're not going to gain any mass baptisms through this process, but Ricci was convinced that this would create a firmer basis and maintain imperial support. Because the moment the emperor turned against you, that was the end of the missions in Ricci's mind. And you can get a lot of his reasoning from the letter that he sent that's included in your reader. So, in fact, it was the Jesuit translation of Confucius that men later, like Voltaire, would use against the church. They were really dedicated to showing how Chinese culture can be fulfilled in the gospel. Two crucial and controversial accommodations were made by the Jesuits in their missions. They were First was to use the Chinese term for God as the Lord of Heaven, thereby paralleling the celestial emperor, who's not quite a creator God, to the God to the Christian God. Ricci says here he was seeking to redefine the term like Paul had done of the unknown God in Athens. The other is Matteo Ricci tolerated Chinese ancestor rites as honorific and secular and not actually as worship. So by making these accommodations, eventually Ricci was able to gain access to the imperial court, to the Forbidden City, and while not actually converting the emperor, he gained greater breathing room for Christianity and the possibility of conversion, mostly, once again, by impressing the emperor with his knowledge of the clock and then gaining an imperial post at the palace in the very heart of the cultural elite. By his death, there's probably only about 2,500 Christians, but some of them were well-placed mandarins. So while they are at court is especially when they became to be known as the Western Confucians. The Giuliano Alenio, the Jesuit, remained at court until 1666 with Johannes Adam Schall von Bell, but they tried their best to navigate the complexity of the Chinese court and make room for the faith. And they had people fight against them. And actually, the ability of the Jesuits to predict properly astronomical eclipse saved them from being completely expelled when they drew the jealousy of some of the other Confucian mandarins at the time. The friars arrive in China and immediately attack the policy of accommodation that the Jesuits were trying to use because of their experience of total confrontation with the new religions in the Americas. They began to arrive in 1633 and they aimed at the conversion of the masses. Their kind of open preaching and their really direct pathway drew attention and anger from the Chinese court, and the conflict also revolved around that the friars thought that the Jesuits were allowing the Chinese to still practice ancestor worship, and that the Chinese ancestor rites were not merely honorific and secular. And this is the Chinese rites controversy. Eventually, it will bring a condemnation. The friars will report what the Jesuits are doing back to Rome. There's debating. Then Rome, there will be a condemnation of the ancestor rites in 1701, although initially in the 17th century it was said it was okay. But it's this condemnation in 1701 which will lead the emperor to expel all missionaries in reprisal. And persecutions would begin in earnest after 1721 in response to Benedict XIV closing the matter, especially in 1740s, that we're not going to talk it again. Although the emperor said that they were not worship, that they were secular, the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith in Rome collectively decided that they were still too much like worship. and that they couldn't be tolerated. Part of what's going on here is also Rome is trying to wrestle control of the missionaries away from the Portuguese during the late 17th century, so that the missionaries can actually be in a stronger position, because the Portuguese were less accommodating, less willing to listen to propaganda fidei, and the powers of their patronage were kind of really frustrating the Eastern missions. But coming back to the question of the Chinese rites, are rites honoring one's ancestors, are they worship or are they veneration? Are they okay? The full answer to this question won't actually come until um, until come to after World War I in Japan, and really not until after World War II with Japan, with the question of kowtowing to the emperor, will eventually lead to the decision on the part of Rome that some of these actions, like the veneration of ancestors or the bowing to the emperor, in Japan could be done in a secular way as a mark of patriotism or a mark as family piety, and they are not necessarily worship, although from the outside, if you look at what's going on, it can look like worship. So really, the fight over the Chinese rites is something that we still go through today, that we have what is worship? What is holding up an image worth of veneration? These controversies still the church still continues to wrestle with. So the great challenge always to the accommodationist, to the enculturation position, is that question from the previous lecture, which is what of the customs are bad? And frequently the missionary personnel do not agree. The Jesuits have one policy of accommodation and the friars have a different policy of what can be accommodated, although the friars do make some policies of accommodation as well, but not nearly as experimental as the part of the Jesuits. So the failure of accommodation is, of course, syncretism, and the failure to accommodate is expulsion. And that seems to be the history of the Eastern missions, at least in the period that we are reviewing. Thank you.